let's continue our discussion about self-discovery as you've described in your book, Internal Power: 7 Doorways to Self-Discovery. And last time we did an overview of the 7 doors, but what I'd like to do this time is to talk about the doorways one by one. The first doorway being choice, and how choice is a vital part of the process of self-discovery as you explain it. In the book, it goes into visualizations that the reader can use to explore this more deeply, but I think for our purposes, if we could talk about why choice is such a vital part of self-discovery and what the key aspects of it are. Certainly it occurs to me that choice is one of these things that really does open a Pandora's box. There are frankly so many choices that it seems to be very difficult to choose. But you always, or you very generally, talk about the self as the place to start, and it's a process of self-discovery. So perhaps I could ask you to start by saying why choice is so important and how it relates to what's going on in oneself.
Sure. In this particular process of self-discovery that began to unfold for me, choice was one of the original pieces, one of the first pieces that really shifted my life in a great 180, in a great way, from an external view to more of an internal view. And the way I experienced it personally was, I was going through life doing everything right, following, what I thought I was supposed to be doing, the suggestions, the scripts, the cultural, the family, the community, the work, all these things that I was doing, according to what I thought was the appropriate action and basically reaction to life. And it was very externalized. I mean, I really didn't have a clue that my thoughts somehow played a role, and apparently, as I began to discover, a very important role as to what I was experiencing. This initial shift, this beginning point where I started to realize that I needed to address this level of unhappiness within, this part of me that was not feeling fully connected anymore to the life the way I was living it, this shift from the outer to the inner, brought me to a quick understanding that my thoughts were a powerful place, a potent portal in a way to what I was experiencing. And it's certainly not anything that I had ever considered. I mean, I knew I had thoughts, but I didn't really think about it. I didn't focus upon it. I didn't contemplate it. I was like, it was just part of this journey I was on, this life. I didn't even know that I was on a journey. It was just simply doing one thing to the next. There was no real sense of self in that relationship. There was just lots of dramas, traumas, trials, tribulations, guilt, worries, and, a few moments of joy. This inner shift very quickly became aware of my thoughts as being a force that was causing and creating and bringing about many of my realities. Particularly if we look at it from the standpoint of change your thoughts, change your perspective, change your attitude, change your life. These cliches that run out there. But with this inner awakening, this inner discovery, the first thing I became aware of was that my thoughts had a tremendous role in the types of experiences I was having. So it became clear and obvious quickly that I needed to pay closer attention to the types of thoughts I was having. In other words, the good, the bad, and everything in between, the critic, the dreamer, all these different aspects of me. As I often share, when I initially started this, if you take a moment, a now moment, a present moment, and really doesn't have a linear time associated to it, but just say a moment of conscious awareness, in that time period, in that moment, there may be 60 thoughts running through my head, through my mind, through my consciousness. And I was probably at the time aware of maybe 5. I was probably paying attention to 5 out of that 60, maybe 10 on a good day. But that fact that these thoughts were also creating my reality, it became abundantly clear that if I'm only paying attention to 5 out of 60. I mean, 55 of these thoughts were creating part of my reality quite unconsciously with very little awareness. That became a potent beginning point from the standpoint of recognizing that I have choice. I can choose different thoughts. I don't have to keep running with the same thoughts that I have, and I don't have to entertain and dwell and contemplate and literally focus on thoughts that are not empowering, if they're not unlimited. This recognition that all these inner negative kind of draining types of thoughts were not empowering the type of life that I actually wanted to live. So this kind of unconscious way of living, and certainly there were choices that were being made that were conscious, like at the time to go for, further education. I mean, there were choices I was obviously making, but I didn't recognize that this power was within me, that my ability to choose differently, to choose thoughts differently, choose perspectives differently. And then eventually I went beyond just the thought, which, power of positive thinking. There's also this component of feeling. And, we'll explore more of the feeling part, because in my journey, the self-discovery didn't initially start so much with the feeling recognition. It kind of came as I began to become more aware of my thinking. So I like to start with the thinking because this is something that's universal in all of us. And one of the reasons why I like to share it is that it is universal in all of us. We all have the ability to pay attention to our thoughts within and then change the types of thoughts and then ask ourselves, is this really a thought I want to continue to have? Is this really the way I look at life? If not, we can change it. We can create a new thought. We can put a more positive thought there. It is the cornerstone and for me in the self-discovery, because choice was not something I was aware that I had. It was always there. But to bring it more consciously, now I could begin a journey of discovering myself and become aware of the types of choices that are before me, that I have choice in which direction to go, that I'm not necessarily limited by perspectives, by fears, by doubts, by worries, by guilt, by other people's suggestions, that I can actually begin to think for myself in ways that are empowering to me. And of course, as we've already discussed in previous conversation, where this led to love for me. So the choice of love in the moment is where I decided to bring it together. And certainly we'll get to that point also, but it was more of an unfolding, more of an evolution. It's not something that was from one moment to the next, I instantly recognized I have choice and then I made all the right choices. I'm still fine tuning it, 2 decades later, my daily choices, my moment to moment choices, because I'm constantly paying attention. But at least now I'm paying attention to 50 or 55 out of those 60 thoughts, that very, very different. In other words, I'm creating my world more consciously versus reacting to my world the way I'd been previously. That really is the value of choice to me.
Well, how many of these 50 or 60 thoughts would you say are probably unconscious? And you're just not registering them consciously, but they are influencing you?
Initially, they were the vast majority, was, probably 50, 55, even probably 58 out of the 60, because I simply didn't recognize that the thoughts that I entertained in my consciousness were actually potent sources of creating my reality. And once I became aware of that, it was fairly easy and quick to begin to focus upon and begin to offer myself new ways of thinking. So within a matter of so many months, where I may have only been aware of 5 out of 60, then it became 10 out of 60, then it became 20 out of 60. In other words, I started to realize that it was an important aspect to pay attention to how I was thinking. Where was my attention? What was I focusing on? Was what I was focusing on really what I wanted to be focusing on? Because one of the things with our mind is that it can be very much like a steel trap. It can get very obsessed and possessed to focus upon one particular thing. And fear and doubt are usually, they're kind of components of each other, but the essence of a fearful thought or a doubtful thought of self is where we often place our attention, partially because I think in the initial stages, I wasn't aware of my thinking. So of course, I wasn't in control I wasn't in a state of awareness of my thinking. So therefore, I was being kind of battered about by my lack of focusing on the types of thoughts I was having. And that battered about actually caused more challenges, dramas, traumas, difficulties, that really were more a product of the fact that I was externally focused rather than internally focused.
Where would you say these unconscious thoughts are coming from? I mean, are they
They are a
memories?
product of our entire lifetime. They are, from the very moment we're born, the suggestions, the feelings, the emotions, the observations, the teachings, from family, from circumstances, from community, from environment. We become kind of like a sponge as a child, and we start to take in all these different types of thoughts and feelings that, and rightly so, that is our way of coming into this world. We will be a product of everything that's around us, and yet there is a unique part of us that is larger and bigger and has a potential that is beyond these suggestions and these environmental conditions and these learnings and these experiences. And in fact, if you realize, like as a child, not knowing that we have choice, not realizing that we can think differently, we have nothing to compare, we simply take in. So if the vast majority of us are walking around without paying attention to our thoughts, we're just being quite unconscious and just literally acting and reacting with each other and taking upon and changing and shifting and molding and manipulating and justifying, all these things are going on one by one with everybody around us. There's a real hodgepodge of belief systems, rituals, traditions. Which of that is ours? And that's the unfolding process when we begin to discover who are we in relationship to life. And we begin to realize that we can choose differently, we can think differently. It doesn't matter what we learned, doesn't matter what our experiences were, we have a choice now to think differently. And that's where we take this external experience, this external power that we tend to focus upon, and we draw it within and realize that we actually have an internal power. We can discover our dreams. We can realize that there are more choices before us than we may have originally thought. And by looking at more choices, one may become much clearer. One may become more obvious because we're no longer limiting ourselves based on old suggestions, old scripts, old teachings. It's a very potent experience when you begin to realize that we can, whatever we can dream of, we can become. Whatever we choose to place our attention on, we can become. And of course, the self-discovery doesn't do away with the fact that we're still interacting with the world around us. So we make adjustments still according to our experiences with our family, with our community, with our environment. It's just that we're now making it more consciously. We're not simply just a product of everything that's going on. We're actually making more conscious, clear, aware choices.
So how do you make these unconscious thoughts more conscious?
Simply by beginning to pay attention to them. In other words, I started to draw my attention within. I started to retrain myself in a way, in the sense that I would listen to my thoughts. I would pay attention to my thoughts. I would observe myself having thoughts. I would observe the types of communication I had with other people. I would begin to notice the types of experiences I was having and thinking, well, what's the thought related to this? I simply just started paying attention. I would stop and reflect. I would actually stop and listen to myself. And the more I did that, the more I, in a way, became conscious in greater and greater ways of all the types of thoughts. And it became kind of a new way of approaching life, is that it wasn't just about everything external. It was now about also incorporating the internal aspects, listening to my body, listening to my thoughts, listening to, the types of inner conversations I was having. And then with that beginning process of actually paying attention and then coupling it with the realization that I have choice, because it's not just really enough, is it, to sit there and say I've got thoughts going on. Well, we all have that. The fact that we have choice, that's where all the power is. That's where all the potential is, because we choose our thoughts differently. So for me, it was simply making and taking the effort to take time to listen within.
And this is going to take some years, isn't it?
Well, it's going to take an entire lifetime or more. In other words, the process is always unfolding. The difference is that where we have consistently trained ourselves to be products of our outer world and just simply be in the outer material world, the discovery process allows all that material world to be there, and then it opens up like a whole new realm of potential, in the sense that now we're not only just a product of our material world, but we're also influencing that material world, and we're co-creating within that material world, and we're participating in that material world much more consciously. So it's really not about, going from one place to another and saying, well, now I've gone from, not being aware of choice to being aware of choice, and now I'm making all the perfect choices. Quite the contrary. Now the adventure begins, because now we can be able to try new ways of thinking out. We can explore and be our own truth. And certainly when you're working with, or walking within a reality that has and is to this day consistently focused on the external, we will begin to have very different types of experiences, because most of the other people are not necessarily on a self-discovery process. So if they're externally focused, they're not going to even be aware of their own inner thinking. If we begin to become aware of our inner thinking, we're also going to become aware of their inner thinking. We're going to be aware of who we are, so we're going to begin to understand the people around us very differently than we had before. We're going to understand ourselves, and then that which is universal within ourselves, we're going to realize is universal in others. So it's almost like you're on the inside of the joke of being on this journey, because now you're realizing the thoughts, the potentials that we all have, and how some of us knowingly and unknowingly simply choose to limit our potential. When you start to open up that potential, now you become aware of self in ways that connects with everybody else's self, and our inability to interact with people grows, because now we begin to become aware of where they're coming from, because we understand where we're coming from. It becomes a much more rich experience, not without its own challenges, because and sometimes when we're doing this, that recognition is we understand where another's coming from plus where we're coming from, versus the old way where we just kind of bump into each other blindly, where a lot of the arguments, a lot of the opinions, a lot of these things crash into each other's, because we're simply trying to follow everybody else's reality and conformity. When you begin to think differently, when you begin to think in much more unlimited potential, then there's a very different interaction with the people around. So it is an ongoing life process, but that's the beauty of it. It's discovery. It's discovering what we didn't know was there. The discovery that I didn't know that I had choice and thought, that was a huge discovery for me, because now all of a sudden I had a whole new way of looking at life. Scary perhaps at first, because this comes with a lot of responsibility. But then you quickly realize, well, I was bumbling around in the darkness in my kind of unawakened state before and managed to get around fairly well. So this just opens it up. It sheds light on our life, and it makes potentials so much greater. And we do get accustomed to, we do get used to, we do get more aware. Comes with greater awareness, comes with greater ease, because now there's less stuff to bump into. In other words, I'm using that kind of as a metaphor, because we're going to be more making choices from our heart. That's where I went. And by making choices from our heart, learning that there's even intuition, all these things that I didn't know even existed, becomes more part of our actual being, becomes more part of all the skills we have, all the opportunities, the wisdom that we have, things that we didn't really know we had. We become more affirming in life rather than critical about life. And of course, if we become more affirming, we start to affirm life rather than being critical towards life. Everything changes in the self-discovery process, and it all hinges on this understanding of choice.
Now, you just said that when you're coming from your heart, that's the place to be when you're making choices. And you said a few moments before that you begin to realize that your choices provide you with an unlimited potential. And one of the things that came to my mind was, well, how do you start reducing the vast number of choices that you could make into choices that are going to be positive, useful for you? But then I think you kind of brought me down to a smaller number of choices. If I'm coming from my heart, which presumably then don't mean that I'm going to make choices that would be damaging to myself or others.
Well, and certainly what you're talking about is what we'll be covering or discussing over the course of this self-discovery conversation that we're having. The love piece didn't come immediately either for me. So as I became aware of the thoughts and feelings, there was this infusion of recognizing that I wasn't just a product of my mind. I wasn't just a product of logic. I wasn't just a product of, one thought in front of another and only thought. By becoming aware of the fact that I had thought, I fairly quickly became aware of this component of feeling. And this component of feeling, which is totally aligned and part of thought. In other words, we have the desire is more of the feeling nature. If we have a single thought and do nothing with it, it's just a single thought. When we infuse it with our personal energy of desire, that thought can become whatever we infuse it with in the amount of desire. In other words, if we're going to build something, it takes the feeling of desire to stay with that focused thought long enough for that thought to become a reality. So there's this energy component of thought that is what I found was really not being discussed. Thoughts were just considered to have, energy of their own making, but that's not entirely true because I have lots of thoughts. And if every thought I had manifested instantly because it had the power to manifest, then I would have a very strange world because I would be surrounded with so much material stuff that I wouldn't be able to breathe. Because if every thought I had just materialized, then it would just be, we couldn't do it. So there has to be something more to it. There has to be like a thought infused with a desire, a thought that is considered over and over again and infused with a desire that becomes a material thing if we stay with it long enough. That's how we create from our dreams. Initially, of course, I wasn't aware of the full ramifications of these components, and yet I was becoming aware of the fact that if things aren't all logical, there is this heart component. There's this place of me that is greater than just the thoughts I'm having. There's this place of desire. There's this place of hope, of dreams, of opportunities. That's where I took my self-discovery in as a process into, then let me find out more about love. And let me focus more. Let me put more of my attention. Let me think more about love. In that thinking process, I began to feel more of the love. The more I expanded, the more I opened myself up to paying closer attention to what my dreams were, my beliefs were, my understandings were, and even changing beliefs and rituals and traditions, things that I had been, brought up to think that this was truth. And I started to realize, that may be true for some, but I'm realizing it's not necessarily my truth. So there's this inner awakening that is of the self, and we could go from a little self to a big self. There's this inner awakening where we become more aware of the present moment of our physical, emotional, mental, and shall we say generally the spiritual well-being. This bigger package that includes all the aspects. It becomes much more holistic, and we're no longer just making a choice because of a limited next step, logical, rational decision. We don't lose our ration. We do still have logic. It's just everything's broader. And as you said, like, how do you take this field of choice? Well, first off, in most cases when you're not conscious, the number of choices for any next step is often very limited. 1, 2, or 3, sometimes 1, sometimes none. People that commit suicide is usually because they don't feel they have any other choice. They've limited themselves to no choice. And the choice that comes out of that is just to leave. So people can get very intellectual, very logical about their understandings because they don't actually realize that there's unlimited potential when you begin to open up. Well, unlimited potential can seemingly be overwhelming and nigh impossible because now you've gone from 1 or 2 choices to infinite choices. Well, what do you do with that? Where do you go with infinite choice? The self-discovery process says, look at all things without attachment, without limitation, and then the clearer, more heart-centered choice will become obvious. And then we begin to focus our thoughts and our feelings, our heart's desire with our mental capacity, our consciousness, and we create from a very different place than creating from our mind. So in that process of opening up a self-discovery, one of the things that is vital from my perspective is that we do open up to the fact that there is unlimited choice. And at first it may be overwhelming, to realize that, well, gosh, I don't have 1, 2, 3, 4 choices. I have 10, 20, 50, 100. Well, how do I make a choice? When you begin to discover the heart versus the constant logic or the mind, we begin to become more aligned with our bigger purpose, our joys, our dreams, our hopes, our expressions that are so in natural alignment that we are no longer acting or reacting to external things. We are simply creating for the sake of creating from our heart center, and then affecting the world around us with a much more holistic, much more heartfelt approach. That discovery process can be as quick or as long, and it really is neither quick nor long because it's ongoing. It's exponential in all directions. So there are things that I learn about myself today that are very different than 20 years ago, and yet no less important and no greater in importance. They're just simply new levels of discovery, and that's where all the fun becomes, because we're able to constantly explore more of ourself in relationship to life around us.
So having the confidence to look at what you really desire for yourself or in your own life, and being prepared to face what that means can imply a very major change in your life, I imagine, because most of us have been guided by lots of unconscious thoughts or lots of influences that we've accepted, and we tend to use our logical mind to help us to make choices. But the world of feeling seems to be a very much more shall I say, a kind of a vague or unformed world where perhaps it's more difficult to make choices, and inevitably it is going to change one's life in a very major way. So how do you start reducing the choices to something that is going to come from your own heart, that you feel is the right thing to do, and but you're still going to have to bring in your mind at the same time to make it logical too. So it still seems to me to be quite a difficult area to really bring it down to practical choices that are going to be effective. But are you saying that you can have confidence in being guided by your heart?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. and in the sense that in the mind likes security, stability. It wants to know the next step. It wants to be very linear. It wants to be sure of everything. And really, if it's look at it as multi-generational, passed down over and over and over again, traditions, beliefs, understandings that have worked to a degree. And yet it's brought about a level of conformity and a level of non-thought. I mean, the unawakened me, that part of me that was only aware of 3, 4, 5 thoughts out of 60, was really a product of the way I was brought up, because no one taught me early on that I had the ability to think and feel differently. What would happen is if in our childhood we were actually made aware quickly and consistently that the whole world was our playground, that everything that we could possibly imagine was something that we could create. We could actually live by our heart, and we could bring about, say, the next, thing that could help all of humanity in our lifetime simply by knowing that we had that potential within us. Certainly, I know in my life and in most of the people I've ever encountered, that was not what any of us were taught. So part of the way you've asked the question is it's like wanting to get there mentally quickly. In other words, let's get done with the self-discovery process so I can get on with life. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the confidence comes with the unknown. The confidence comes with constantly discovering and rediscovering and discovering again more and more of my own personal potential. So the confidence for me is recognizing that I don't need to know it all. I don't need to have all the right answers. I don't need to make all the right choices. I simply need to explore. I simply need to look at what brings me joy with a sense of the joy from the heart, the true joy. And we're not talking about the logical joy or the the very hedonistic, let me just go out and do anything kind of, experience and have no responsibility. This is quite different. The self-discovery process really initiates our conscious recognition of our responsible way of looking at life. In other words, we begin to take the journey and actually take back our personal power, probably for the first time ever in our lifetimes, and especially in a big way if we really dive into self-discovery and really want to find out what we're made of, really want to find out what we're capable of. That level, that recognition, say, for example, the metaphor I often uses, there may be a person that is conditioned in many ways and begins to believe that they're supposed to become educated and become a lawyer in their lifetime. Where in fact, if that person really followed their heart, even knew they had a heart, recognized their own inner yearnings, their own inner dreams, they might actually be a phenomenal carpenter. And yet they're conditioned to be something very different. There might be a carpenter out there who would make a fantastic lawyer. There might be a doctor who would be an incredible violinist. Mm-hmm. Who of us are willing to do something that is really based on our complete whole aspect, our whole self? That's something that I undertook. Certainly when all these things began to unfold, I went from a very business regimented, educated, master's degree in business, all these things that I was doing, and simply chose differently and went on a completely different pathway, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, led to writing books, doing TV, giving lectures and seminars, and eventually even starting, a global nonprofit. None of those things were even vaguely, not even a hint, a whisper, and even a notion in my consciousness at the time that was even a part of a possibility of my lifetime. Because I was so regimented in a particular way. But once I let go and I started to explore, these things didn't happen. Your book didn't happen the first day or the second day. It happened a couple of years later. The nonprofit didn't happen immediately. It happened 10 years later. The global experience didn't happen then. It happened a few years after that. So the difference, though, for me was that I started to listen to my heart. I started to listen to my inner inspiration. And that's going to be unique to me. How do we label that? Why do we label that? I can't explain another person's inspiration, its source, or anything, and I have no desire to. Mm-hmm. I just understand that we all have it. And we have the ability to change our thinking. We have the ability to change our life. We have the ability to align our life to something that is much more fulfilling. And maybe that's a better way than saying joy. Because if we're fulfilling our life in a way that is genuine for us, then we are naturally going to have a very powerful, positive impact on the world around us. If we're living a life trying to be right for everybody else and we're not happy within, that unhappiness is going to come through in everything. So that's where I was. In this fundamental shift, realizing that I had choice, that I could begin the process somewhere. And I think that's why we use this as the first doorway. This is the cornerstone. This is the beginning point. All these other things that you've asked about or addressing happen naturally as we begin to unfold. These other questions that you're asking about do happen when we accept the fact that we have choice right now. Because if I have choice right now, I can think differently. And if I don't like the thought I have, for whatever reason, if it's too limiting, too unempowering, then I can simply say, okay, thank you, thought. Let's look for another one. Let's look for a new way of looking at life. And then it expands and expands and expands rather than limit.
So are the two vital elements to this. First of all, recognizing that you may be having thoughts that are not in your best interests, and spending your life, as you say, being aware of the kind of thoughts you have. And the second one being then start working out what's in your heart to do, because what's in your heart to do is probably the best basis for your own choices that you could find.
Well, part of what we're conditioned to understand is what we can vaguely label positive and negative thought. I think all of us recognize on some level that we would understand positive thought to some degree and negative thought to another degree. We tend to externalize it in our outer world. Culturally, we say good, bad, right, wrong. Everything's a judgment. Positive and negative thought is really a way of saying let me understand this in a bigger, broader sense. And through all of our conversations, I like to take that bigger picture, because when we see the bigger picture, the immediate picture in front of us makes more sense. When we're right up front of something, it's very difficult to get proper perspective. So rather than saying something is good or bad, right or wrong, look at it from more of a positive, negative thought, and even there, drop the judgment. We have this natural tendency to judge everything in one way, or one contrast to another. Negative thought by itself is not necessarily bad thought or wrong thought. It simply is recognizing that we are limiting our expression. We're limiting the way we're thinking. And if we continue on that path of limitation, we will basically destroy whatever we're doing, because that limitation doesn't express the fullness of what we're capable of. Negative thought often helps us understand positive thought. So we might have a negative critical thought as a way to give us contrast of something that we can choose higher. If we don't actually at times recognize that we have choice, then of course it's very easy to stay in negative thinking. We can even say in our outer world, and even ourselves, if we can acknowledge it, we know what it's like to be around a negative person. We're very aware of that energy, because it's very difficult to be around that, because it's such a draining, unempowering experience. Well, most of us, and I say this, generally, but it certainly was true for me, and it's been very true for many of the people I've met. We walk around with a lot of negativity. We walk around with a lot of limitation. We walk around with a lot of, very narrow, limited numbers of choices. We don't look at the world as being filled with potential. We look at, we make this much money, so we can only afford that much. We make, we have these obligations, so we can only do those things. When you begin to change that way of looking at life, when you start to open up to a much more positive, enriching, life-affirming energy, it's not about being Pollyanna. It's not about looking at life through rose-colored glasses or falsely. It's recognizing positive as being a much more unlimited way of thinking. So in this sense, negativity is more limited. Positive thinking is a much more unlimited way of looking at life. And the more unlimited, more life-affirming we are, the more we experience life-affirming events in our life. The more we literally draw ourselves to people that are more positive. The more we bring ourselves into situations that are more uplifting and more empowering. You can take any kind of example out there in the way when we're externally focused. If we have a strong inner critic, we have a much greater chance of being involved in, say, things like drug and alcohol, or somehow events, experiences that are much more challenging, debilitating, more dramatic, more traumatic, because we don't feel good about ourselves. So we look for external resources to try to somehow either suppress or stabilize or minimize that strong negative component in our lives. Where in fact, all we really need to do is become aware of our personal power, should it be so simple. And by recognizing our personal power and saying, like, I have a choice here. I can choose differently. And the more we raise our energy to more uplifting, the more many, many things in our lives begin to change. The types of experiences we engage are very different when we feel good about ourselves. When we don't feel good about ourselves, we tend to engage in very low, negative, limited ways of living life. When we feel confident and encouraged and encouraging and feel a sense of life going through us, we conquer all kinds of things. And we have countless examples of people that have, over the lifetimes, over the many centuries, that have just done extraordinary things, essentially because they felt confident in their ability. They affirmed that they could do these, they could explore these things, and oftentimes they're the pioneers, because they're willing to say, I'm going beyond status quo, I'm going beyond just what I've been taught, and I'm going to explore more of myself in relationship to life. So positive thinking, broader terms, and we'll cover that too in another conversation more in depth of how to bring more positive thinking, more positive feeling. But certainly we need to acknowledge that in our own thoughts and feelings right now, we often have this spectrum of positive, negative thinking, and we want to bring our thoughts and feelings into more of an alignment of life-affirming approach.
Mm-hmm. So while we're looking for the kind of choices that might be our best choices for ourselves. And would you feel that the chances are that perhaps all the way through our lives, our heart has been saying one thing to us, or one or more things to us, whilst the head has been saying other things? And actually we really ought to give the heart a chance and remind ourselves of what we've often said we would love to do. You know, what we would really, really love to do if we had what we think is the opportunity which obviously we can make for ourselves. Is that a very good place to start?
You know, as I look backwards, you know, or back in time, you know, like when I was doing everything so-called right, and I was in management, in finance, and I had, you know, some key managers above me, but then I also interacted a lot with frontline employees as a manager. And one of the things that I think started this recognition of inner unhappiness was that I had a natural, one could say talent, or a natural affinity, talent in the external and an internal affinity towards really loving and respecting people. I enjoyed people. And it was very difficult in the business hierarchy that I was in, because I also understood the bigger visionary aspect, like to be a visionary or to lead, you know, a company, for example, that you have to look at the bigger picture, you know. But because I was in that in-between state, I had a very deep respect and honor, and had seen the key employees that were often working with customers as having tremendous dignity and tremendous worth. And then I recognized the value of, you know, the brilliance at times of the people who are able to run the companies, but there seemed to be this chasm in between. The ones that ran the company didn't seem to recognize the people on the front line as having an equal importance. And the ones, of course, on the front line not feeling as part of the whole often had great disdain for the choices that management made because they weren't being included, they weren't being recognized. I could understand both on the bridge. I could understand both realities, and yet I felt like there was a better way to look at life, or a different way that was more complete, where everybody's presence was acknowledged. And that caused this inner stirring, that caused this inner, you know, initial awakening, saying I needed to look at life differently because this wasn't working for me. And where I had spent a decade in the business world, I chose, you know, now I can say actually quite courageously, and others would say, you know, rather bravely, to simply walk away from all of it into the self-discovery process, which led to writing books and sharing and whatnot from my own personal experiences. That initial shift, though, you know, over a time period of a couple of years where I really began to go within and discover myself, I actually kind of developed three questions, or three new life goals, you know, where before it was, you know, career, what was the right thing? How do I advance and do things and, you know, become more part of the community, part of the career, part of the family, part of relationships. I actually went to a very different place where I started to say, what do I really feel like doing in life? In other words, very clean the slate, very fundamentally, what would seemingly bring me joy? And I realized that I wanted to help people, I wanted to travel, and I wanted to be in charge of my own life. I wanted the freedom that came with being my own person. And from that state, that time period, those decisions were like universal life goals for me that are still true today. They've outlived every other type of experience, in that I still enjoy assisting people where I can. I still enjoy traveling in a way to meet people. And I like being free to make my own day each day and create as I go through my day. That's kind of an example of how fundamentally different, you know, this is than when we say, you know, certainly people have careers, they have families, they're taking care of, you know, their families, you know, they might be the main source of income, you know, all these things. We're not saying throw those out the window. Absolutely not. We're saying just simply become aware of and find ways to bring our true self into these experiences. Be more intimate, honest, integrated, vulnerable, aware, conscious, and hopefully, you know, my hope is that people will begin to recognize their own heart center, their own greater sense of self, and in that heart center realize that they have love to give, and that if they infuse self-acceptance and self-love with themselves, that they will then be able to turn around and share this love, with everyone around them more universally, more naturally, more intimately, without all these conditions and constrictions and limiting thoughts and beliefs and traditions, all these rituals, all these things that have really kept us from expressing who we really are. We don't have to throw all of it out. We simply need to evolve it into something more.
Okay. Well, if you feel you've covered the main aspects of choice now, would you like to give us a little bit of a rundown on what the next element is, the next doorway, as an introduction to our next conversation?
It's with the choice, with the beginning thoughts, that we have thoughts and that we can and perhaps really should be paying attention to our thoughts. The next doorway of discovery for me is really, if having said all the things of being unlimited and an exponential, non-logical, the next thing that's really quite logical is that to further engage, we need to become very aware of the communication process. And where I had come from, communication was always considered an external aspect of, how we communicate to people, places, and things around us. And what we'll discover in the next one is how our inner communication is vital, and our non-physical and non-verbal communication is vital. So it's really quite a way of going deeper into the awareness of just what are these thoughts, how do we think and feel, and what kind of choices can we make when we open up our recognition as to how all this plays with everything else, all interconnected, all interdependent, and all part of a very synergistic self-discovery process.
Okay, well, I look forward to that, Harold. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Pleasure.